It would be really easy for me to come out here every week and say, yeah, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, those are your must-start guys this week. Obviously, we know they're must-starts. We're going deeper than that. And even through doing that, through the time I've been doing this for about 4 weeks now, I've still got a 60% plus hit rate on my must-start guys. So make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. And let's get into our first guy right here that I think is an absolutely excellent start. And I've heard tons of talk about Tyrone Tracy Jr. One of the couple questions that I've been getting asked kind of frequently is he just overhyped? You know, did we overhype this guy when he finally became the RB1 in New York? With Tyrone Tracy Jr., I've said it in a couple different ways. I think Tyrone Tracy Jr. is a very good player. He does a lot for them. He both catches the ball and he runs the ball much more efficient than Devin Singletary does. But there also is the element to this that he does play for the New York Giants, meaning that he's going to have some bad games because sometimes they can't move the ball very well offensively. Well, this week he's taking on the Carolina Panthers, obviously. And if you just, before we get into the matchup, if you just go back to what he's done throughout the entire season, outside of week 7, when he finally became the starter, which was in week 5, he's had at least 16 carries in every single game. That's just outside of week 7. And that week 7 game was versus Philadelphia. And that was the game where they were absolutely demolished from the beginning of that game. They had no chance to win, so they just didn't run the ball very much towards the end. And they kind of waved the white flag at the end, saying that they surrendered. His production in that game was bad, obviously. 6 carries, 23 yards, 4.7 fantasy points in a half PPR format. But week 9 last week obviously was a disappointing outing for Tyrone Tracy Jr. as well. But if you actually looked at that game, the production itself was not bad. The production itself is not bad. 16 carries for 66 yards. That is not a bad week of actual NFL production. It just didn't hit for fantasy in particular. As I just said, he's on a bad team, so that unfortunately makes him matchup dependent a lot. But this week is the perfect matchup versus Carolina, who is dead last versus the running back position in fantasy football. I think Tyrone Tracy Jr. is a must-start guy. I've already been telling people that this week. He's got to find a way into your lineup. Now, the next guy that I want to go through here is someone that has really just kind of fell quiet over the last month and a half of fantasy. Jauan Jennings. Jauan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. He's taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week in Tampa off of the bye week. So with Jauan Jennings, obviously we all remember he had one of the best games in fantasy this year. It was like his week that week, Alvin Kamara's week one week, and also Jamar Chase, of course, lit the world on fire on Thursday night. Jauan Jennings had a massive week in week 3. But since then, he's been pretty quiet in fantasy football. It's important to keep a couple things in mind with Jauan Jennings in particular, though. So obviously, after the big breakout game, there was the games where he just went kind of quiet. Well, a lot of those games, Brandon Ayuk was still there. Deebo Samuel was still there, right? So he was at best their wide receiver 3/wide receiver 2, because Ayuk had been underperforming for the majority of the season at that point, and he was just in a position where sometimes he would just outproduce Ayuk, but it still wouldn't mean that much because Deebo was still there taking up a bunch of work as well. And then since then, he's missed the last 2 games with the injury, and he's coming off a bye week in week 9. So the last 3 weeks in fantasy, we have not seen or heard from Jauan Jennings. So it's easy to forget about this type of player who is actually on quite a bit of waiver wires this week. If he's still out there, he's a plug-and-play guy this week to me. Coming off a bye week in week 9, so they're obviously more well-rested. He's got the perfect opportunity this week versus the Bucs. They are 28th versus the wide receiver position. They've been giving up points to every wide receiver that comes to mind. DeAndre Hopkins just lit them up on Monday night. So Jauan Jennings is in a great opportunity. And obviously, Ayuk is out. Jennings is questionable as of right now, so make sure to monitor how his practice day goes on Friday. But Deebo Samuel's questionable too. So even if both of them do play, neither one of them is going to be fully healthy, meaning that Jauan Jennings should get opportunities in this game. If Jauan Jennings plays, I'm in. It's just really as simple as that. I want in on Jauan Jennings if he ends up playing in this game. Now, the next guy that I want to go to, I did not think I'd be on this train this week, but here we are with Tank Dell. Tank Dell is taking on the Detroit Lions on Sunday night in Houston this week. So it's a dome game for whatever that's worth. You know, like I said, I thought I was going to be off the Tank Dell train this week. I really do think that Tank Dell, when Nico comes back, is not going to be a must-start guy. But the matchup this week is obviously great. Let's just get that out of the way. Detroit is 27th versus the wide receiver position in fantasy football. Matchup makes tons of sense, right? Nico Collins is probably out again. Now, before I started filming, I did see that they had activated him off of the IR, but his status for Week 10 is still to be determined. The fact that he hasn't practiced at all this week probably indicates they're going to sit him another week. So with Nico Collins here, if Nico is out, some may argue, actually, that Tank Dell will be better with Nico Collins here. Well, let's just look at reality over the last several weeks. There's no argument that he's been better and he's had his best games without Nico Collins. In Week 6 versus New England, he had 18.7 fantasy points, full PPR, 9 targets, 7 catches, 57 yards, and a touchdown. Green Bay, goose egg. Massive goose egg without Nico Collins here. Indianapolis, 13.5 fantasy points. Another solid week there because he gets back in the end zone. And then last week, not only was there no Nico, there was no Stephon Diggs as well. And that's when he had his best game of the year. Outside of that Week 6 game versus New England, 18.6 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 catches, and 126 receiving yards. So Tank Dell obviously needs to be by himself or at least the number 2 clearly. And he wasn't getting that with Nico and with Stephon Diggs. But now, at least Stephon Diggs is definitely out, and Nico is probably out again. So again, when you're looking at this matchup here versus Detroit, who is 27th versus the wide receiver position in fantasy football, it makes complete sense that Tank Dell needs to go back into your lineup. Because when you factor in with no Nico Collins and no Stephon Diggs, maybe Nico plays, and I think he'd still be an okay start, but especially if Nico does not play this game, Tank Dell needs to go into your lineup. One other thing that you must do this week, this is not debatable. You need to stack Tank Dell with getting CJ Stroud's pick on underdog this week because it's at 0.5 total yards. Sweat-free pick, you hit the higher, you're basically winning free money. So if you have not taken advantage of underdog yet, go down there in the comments and grab the link that's there and use code FFN to sign up for underdog. When you take advantage of the sweat-free projection and hit the higher on CJ Stroud's projection this week, they will match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash. Now going on to our next guy, our quarterback start of the week this week. Feel really great about this one. Sam Darnold of the Minnesota Vikings. He's taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars in Jacksonville this week. Now with Sam Darnold, I don't think people understand this really. He's been low-key one of the most consistent quarterbacks in fantasy this year. Now, he doesn't always have the biggest ceiling or anything like that. Obviously, you can see the numbers on the screen. There's only one game in there that he had a single-digit fantasy performance, and that was in Week 5 versus the Jets. Now, if you remember that game in particular, it was a wet, rainy day. It was a nasty game. Nobody wanted to play in that weather, and it was a low-scoring affair. It was a wet and nasty game. So, obviously, I'm not excusing the performance, but I am saying that there's a reason why that ended up happening. Now, one game outside of that was less than 17 fantasy points, and that's a really good mark to hit for a quarterback, obviously. One game was in Week 1 versus the New York Giants. And obviously, that was his first game as a starting quarterback in years. So that's okay. But since then, and you take out that one game versus Week 5, this guy's producing 20, 25-point games in fantasy football very, very consistently. And this matchup doesn't get any better than this. Jacksonville, 31st versus the quarterback position in fantasy football. They are a disgraceful defense. I've been saying this for weeks. And their team is a sinking ship. It's actually already sunken. This is the Titanic. I already made the comparison because you know it, I know it, everybody knows it. This is just a disgraceful team. The Jacksonville Jaguars is a fantastic matchup. The only thing that can hold Sam Darnold back in this game is the rain. And it is expected to be a rainy game here. So obviously make sure you pay attention to that. But at the same time, as bad as Jacksonville is, they're so bad. They're a disgrace. As bad as they are, I don't think that Sam Darnold has a bad game here because I expect him to be pretty efficient in this game and probably toss a few touchdowns because he's got the weapons and he's got the matchup on his side. And our tight end start of the week here, Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills at the Indianapolis Colts this week. Listen, I drafted Kincaid in a lot of places. Redraft leagues, I've got him in a dynasty league. I've got him in a bunch of best ball leagues. Like, I drafted Kincaid because I thought he was going to be much better than he's been. Now, he's the tight end 12 on the year and a half PPR format. He has not been bad necessarily, but it's been major disappointment when you factor in the draft capital and everything attached to it. He's had only 2 games over 10 fantasy points in a half PPR format. It's not very good. He's averaging also, this is what also doesn't make sense, he's averaging almost 7 targets per game since week 3. Like, he's not been irrelevant in this offense. He has not been a ghost. He's actually been really relevant every single week. But if you look at the 2 games that he's had over 10 fantasy points, he had a touchdown in both those games, and they were against Jacksonville and Seattle. Those are also really bad teams against the tight end position. Now this week, he's taking on Indianapolis, who is 31st versus the tight end position. So it doesn't get much worse than the Indianapolis Colts here versus tight ends. And also factor in this, Keon Coleman has already been ruled out. Amari Cooper is a true questionable. He was limited in practice all week, and a lot of those days of practice, he wasn't even catching balls. His wrist is not ready yet. So he may end up missing this game as well. They simply need to use Dalton Kincaid in this matchup. It's a good matchup. He's very necessary in this offense. I think he gets back in the end zone this week and is a good tight end play. So let me know how your lineup is looking so far this weekend. If you want to see the top 30 running back rankings for this week, click on this video right here.